Well, actually, I was born in Korea, in the city of Daegu in the south, although I can't say that my interest in Korea necessarily began at that point. As I got older, like many children of Korean and other immigrant background, I became very curious about my ancestry and about the Korean culture. When I got to college, I became really interested in East Asian culture more broadly. I ended up majoring in East Asian studies with a focus on China. Like many Yale undergraduates, I fell under the spell of Jonathan Spence when I attended his History of Modern China course my freshman year. And from my sophomore year onward, I studied Chinese. And I had intended to go to China, but I was also interested in the Korean language. There was no Korean language course at Yale. So I approached Samuel Martin, who was one of the leading American scholars of Korean and Japanese language. And I asked him if I could take a kind of private course with him on the Korean language. He was reluctant to do that. He told me frankly that he's been asked this before by Korean American students who seem to be just interested in their heritage and not serious about studying the language. So he declined. I then in my senior year asked my professor of Korean politics, Hong Young Lee, and he said there's a language program at Yonsei University which you might find useful. So I applied to that, and I went there intending to stay for the summer. But the summer in Korea got more and more extended. I became more and more interested in learning the language in greater depth. I started from very elementary Korean at Yonsei, and I eventually stayed for 2 years, going all the way through the Korean language program. Eventually, at the end of the 2 years, I did have the opportunity to go to China, and I taught English at Jilin University in Changchun. There was this enormous ethnic community in China, many of whom even fourth-generation Koreans could speak fluent Korean, unlike most of the Koreans in the United States, that had their own history and their own distinct sort of version of Korean culture. And there were also North Koreans. There was also this other Korea on the Korean Peninsula, the North, which was very different from the South. It was fascinating to talk to Koreans whose idea of what Korea was, whose own sort of cultural understanding and own background was so different from the Koreans I encountered in the United States and in South Korea. So it was at that point, in a way ironically, in my year in China, that I decided I really wanted to study modern Korean history. I wanted to try to understand how Korea came to be what it is today. I wasn't really involved with the Korean American student groups at Yale. There weren't that many Korean American students at that time. I had some Korean American friends, and I attended, I think, 1 or 2 meetings of the Undergraduate Korean Association. But I didn't feel entirely comfortable with them. Now, I think looking back, I can see that this was just the beginning of what became a much more diverse and thriving Korean American student body at Yale. But at the time, it was just really in its nascent stage. And I'm also very pleased that Korean studies is being taught at Yale, Korean language and other subjects. And I hope that the Korean language or the Korean studies program continues to expand, because I think there's a great need for that. And I would hope that, unlike in my day, students who are interested in studying Korea, whether they're Korean American or not, have the opportunity at Yale to do that in greater depth. Well, the events of the last year or so have to be seen in a broader context of rising tensions on the Korean Peninsula over the last couple of years, which has to do with changes both in South Korea and in North Korea. In the case of South Korea, there has been a more conservative government that's come into power since the beginning of 2008, which takes a harder line toward the North than its 2 predecessors. In the North, there's been a very negative reaction to this, and the North also seems to be going through a transition of power within their own leadership. And also, North Korea has become even more kind of defensive society and sort of militarized than it was before. and it seems, at least for now, determined to have a nuclear deterrent. And that's been a major issue, of course, between the United States and North Korea's nuclear program. So within this context of increasing tensions on the Korean Peninsula, we had the explosion that killed 46 sailors on the South Korean ship Cheonan in March of 2010, which an international investigation team determined to have been destroyed by a North Korean torpedo. The North Koreans have denied responsibility. Then, in November, there was a shelling of Yeonpyeong Island by North Korean artillery, the first time there's been an artillery attack across the boundary on South Korean soil since the Korean War. And this was undisputably North Korean responsibility, and indeed the North Koreans did not deny it, but have said that they were responding to a South Korean provocation. We've come back a little bit from that in the last few months, and now the two sides are talking again, or at least talking about talking, and the really dangerous brink of open conflict we found ourselves in last year has gotten a little bit better. Still, as long as Korea remains divided in this tense military standoff between North and South, there can be no permanent resolution of this conflict. Hopefully, things will move to a situation where we can have a more stable peace environment, but we're a long way from that right now. What's interesting about this transition to Kim Jong-un, many close observers to North Korea before this became public didn't really think this could happen, that there might be some kind of collective leadership or some other form of power succession. But it seems that after 60 years of one family being in power, the North Korean leadership can't go forth with any other kind of leadership at the top other than that of the lineage of the Kim family. Kim Jong-il, I think, wants to stay alive and healthy long enough to make sure that this transition is smooth. But we don't know what will happen. We don't know what kind of leader Kim Jong-un will be or how long he can stay in power. We do, I think, have a pretty clear idea that the regime will try to push this through and that Kim Jong-un, over time, will consolidate his power base. But once Kim Jong-il goes, it's very hard to say what will happen to the continued leadership of Kim Jong-un. Remember that the word Kyopo is related to the Chinese character for bridge, and Kyopos can function as a kind of bridge between cultures, between generations, between Korea and America. As we become a more integrated world, and as Korea itself becomes more globalized, I think the role of Kyopos, the role of overseas Koreans, becomes even more important, both for Korea, both as a connection of Korea to the outside world, and to the U.S. in particular, but also for the United States, which still doesn't know Korea very well. Korea, I think, is the least well understood country relative to its importance for the United States. And Kyopos are a critical transmitter of knowledge and understanding across this boundary between America and Korea. And whatever their background, whatever their degree of separation, whether they're immigrants themselves or children or even grandchildren of immigrants, whether they're of mixed parentage, I think the overseas Koreans have a role to play in this connection between the U.S. and Korea that is really vital for both sides.